If you're a piano player and have connectivity to a church, odds are that at some point you may have been asked to play the organ. And I know for a number of piano players, thinking about the leap from a piano to an organ, which has multiple manuals, foot pedals, can seem daunting. So today's conversation is going to be about a piano player's guide to the organ. This is going to be just the tip of the iceberg because this topic we can get into things that would be like lesson after lesson after lesson. But I did want to share some thoughts and some tips because I have been in that position years ago and have made the leap. And over the years, there's a few things that have made a big difference. I was going to share those in this video. So I'm using this video as an anchor over a number of videos I've posted over the last few months actually, of music selections that I've taken from one of the editions of The Organist published by Lorenz. In my garage, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of these books and many, many other organ books. And from time to time, I just grab something and then use it for sight reading. And I grabbed one of the oldest Lorenz publications that I have and just decided I was going to go through the whole book and then almost every single week publish one of the pieces in these books. All right, so this is the book I've been playing out of, Lorenz Organist. This was published in 1952, January 1952. And since then, Lorenz, I believe, continues to publish The Organist. I had a subscription. They have a subscription series. Years ago, I subscribed to that. So I've got, again, dozens of these editions in the garage. And let me get into, I guess, a little bit about why I decided to focus a little bit on these selections. And there's been a few reasons. One is it's a look back into church music that was common in the 1950s. I grabbed this book published back in 1952. So it is a lens into what people may have heard when they stepped into churches back in the 1950s. Some of this music not much different from what you might find at some churches today. It's also music that I don't think has been effectively captured and preserved. You don't hear much of this type of music. So to put it out on YouTube at least is an opportunity to preserve this style of music. It's just a glimpse of that history of music that had been written for a specific function, specific purpose, and we get a chance to hear it. Within the Organist book, all of the pieces that are in here, at least in these editions, had registrations for Hammond organ as well as pipe organ registrations. So almost all of the selections that I played out of this book, I tried to use the Hammond registrations. I think there might have been one piece, maybe two tops, where I did use pipe organ registrations. But it's also a nice way to hear how the Hammond organ was used and registered for in church music, or music that was designed to service church services. It also brings back to me memories of the position in music that the organ once used to hold. When I was a kid, it was rare to go to a mall and not see a store in there dedicated to keyboard instruments and primarily organs. And back in the day, you would have at just about any mall in the United States an organ store that would have electronic organs from companies like Kahn, Thomas, Hammond, Lowry, Wurlitzer, Gulbranson, maybe Yamaha. Many of these keyboards were sold for home entertainment. Some of them had rhythm machines included in them. I even remember when I was a kid seeing one, it was a 3-manual instrument, 2 normal keyboards, and then a very small keyboard on top that was actually one of the first synthesizers that was made available. I don't know who made that, but that was part of the evolution that organ manufacturers went through back in the day. And there was this whole genre of music a style of performance that, again, it's interesting. It's one of these things that hasn't been captured. From time to time, I'll come across home tapes that people have made on those types of instruments and listen to the kind of music that was played and how it was played, and it's just interesting to go back in time. So one of the things I was hoping to accomplish by going back in time with the organist is just to give that lens, that historic lens. But back to the topic of today, A Piano Player's Guide to the Organ. When I was put in the position years ago of being asked to move from the piano to the organ, I found myself, at the time, a very accomplished pianist, could tackle just about anything on the piano, from the advanced works of Chopin, Beethoven, Prokofiev, some of the monster works. But when I got to the organ, I just felt like didn't know what I was doing, didn't know where to start. I think when I first had the opportunity to start on the organ, the church nearby where I lived had an old Baldwin organ, and it had a bass coupler on there. So the lady at the time, who was the choir director and gave me an opportunity to play on the organ, suggested that where I start is to play manuals only. She pointed out the bass coupler, and with that I was able to, with my left hand, call up the bass notes that otherwise would be played on the pedals, and kind of trudge my way on the instrument using that approach. Not ideal, but it was one way to start. And I just remember being frustrated in that I wanted to play more traditional organ, and ended up finding organ scores. When I think about the organ, or when I thought about the organ back then, works that came to mind were obviously, like, for example, pieces by Bach. So I found some of the organ works by Bach, put them on the organ rack, and it was just daunting, because one of the, I think, the leaps that people have to make, that I had to make at least, was, as a piano player, your brain is trained to read two different parts of music. You're reading a treble clef, you're reading a bass clef, and then your brain translates what you're reading in the treble clef to your right hand, typically, right? And then what you're reading in the bass clef to your left hand, and you're processing those two things simultaneously, two things or four things, depending how you want to look at it. And then when you get to organ music that's written for three staves, you have a clef for the right hand, a clef for the left hand, and then a clef for the pedals. Now your brain has to move from reading two different things to reading three different things, and then processing that extra layer of information, and then translating it through your body to come out in both your hands and your feet simultaneously. And that just stumped me. I found, I had the music in front of me, and I could either play the right hand and the left hand and be fine, or I could play the right hand and the pedal, or I could play the left hand and the pedal. But to do all three initially was this hurdle that I found great difficulty in getting past. So you fast forward, one day I was browsing music at a sheet music store. Well, we used to have sheet music stores. There's another thing that we don't have a lot of anymore. But there was a section devoted to organ music, and I happened to find a book that was published by Lorenz. It wasn't this one. It would have been something that was probably published in the 1980s, 1990s. But same gist, right? It was this type of music. One of the things that is common in this music that's published in The Organist, I'll probably maybe put some examples on the screen as well, is there's a lot of the music in these publications that's intended for right hand, left hand, and feet, but published only on two staves. So the treble clef carries the right hand, but on the bass clef in this music, The Organist by Lorenz, you've got kind of intertwined on one staff what's supposed to be played by your left hand, as well as what you're going to carry on the bass pedals. And something about having the music presented that way, all of a sudden it allowed my brain to process those three pieces of information more effectively, because I only had to read what seemed to be two areas. So I think tip number one is if you're trying to make the leap from piano to organ, and if you're struggling reading 3 lines of music, I would suggest find something like this music published by Lorenz. There might be other things out there as well. But if you find music that's prepared to carry those 3 areas, right hand, left hand, and bass pedals, but on 2 staves, that may be your entryway into helping to shift your brain into that transition. So I did find that having music that was written for 2 staves all of a sudden made it easier to play. And that interested me, so I ended up learning some more about Lorenz and their publications and found out they had a whole subscription series to The Organist. So I signed up for that, and for several years those would come to me. And I found those publications helpful for making the transition. One of the things that was helpful in making the transition from piano to organ. So something else I'll say about the music that's published in The Organist. Again, I mainly will grab some of these today and personally use it really just for sight reading. My church gig is at a Catholic church, and it's at what is called an FSSP parish. So we're talking traditional Latin Mass. So just about everything that you would have heard in the series that I've played over the past few months on the YouTube, music from the Lorenz, is music that really I would never bring to those church services, because I think you have to have an awareness of what's the aesthetic where you're being asked to contribute music. So at a traditional Latin Mass scenario where the music has a lot of chant, it may have a lot of polyphony, it may have traditional hymnody, it brings forth a certain type of aesthetic, and the organ music that needs to be selected to surround that, what I find works well in that, lots of Baroque music, sometimes modal compositions, sometimes will work, but much of the classical genre, the traditional classical genre with an emphasis on the Baroque, that's what I use there. When I've played at what are called the Novus Ordo Catholic parishes, which is the mainstream, probably 95% or more, there were more times there where I could probably get away with playing selections from something like this. And I think many traditional Protestant churches, that's really where this type of music would have flourished and perhaps still flourishes today. So there's that point. Back to the topic of this transition for piano players to the organ, a couple of other things that I would recommend are some good resources to have. One thing I would recommend is a good organ method book. There's lots of them out there. One that I have here that I've used is Method of Organ Playing by Harold Gleason. And this is useful. It was also helpful for me in kind of making that transition. This will take you through basics of the organ, information on registration, information on how to ornament on the organ, stylistic notes, interpretation notes, techniques for playing the manuals, exercises both for the manuals as well as for manuals and feet, information on hymns, pedal technique, pedal exercises. So a book like this is really helpful because it'll help to fill in the gaps that exist for people who have only ever played the piano. So a good organ method book is useful. You might also find yourself finding 2 manual repertoire. There's a lot out there. So just because you're sitting at an organ doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be accompanied with both hands playing and the foot pedals going at the same time as well. There's a plethora of manuals only music, so you can find some of that. One good resource for organ music or music in general is the website IMSLP. Highly recommend a subscription to that. You can search for music, for example, by type of instruments. I'll often go there. I'll use the filter for organ. And you're going to find more music there than you'll ever get a chance to play in your lifetime. But you can quickly browse through different difficulties, 2 manuals, or 2-stave music, 3-stave music, music from the Baroque to almost the present day. Just a wonderful wealth of music that's available. So that's very useful. Another resource that I would highly, highly recommend is the American Guild of Organists. So one of the things this organization does, it provides resources that are helpful to up and coming organists. And somewhere along my early days of moving from piano to organ, I stumbled across them and found that they had a certification series, and I got involved in that. I think the entry-level certification is what they call the service playing certificate, which comes with a learning tract for the player to go through, as well as resources. And then at the end, you do have to get the certificate, demonstrate proficiency. So I found that useful to go through that. I did use the American Guild of Organists track to go through what they call the colleague level certification. So a little bit more advanced. And again, it just provided foundational elements, provided goalposts for me, provided milestones to shoot for. And so that was very helpful. The American Guild of Organists, but also, I guess when I did the certification, they would have had like cassette tapes available that took you through things like service playing techniques, organ registration, techniques to use for hymns. I suspect today they don't have cassette tapes anymore, but they actually, now when I think about it, it was probably compact disc. But whatever the medium is, there may be digital files today, but they'll probably have something like that available. And those tracks, the certification tracks, I think are very helpful. Having practice time is useful. So when I was making this move, I ended up finding time at my local church once a week where I could go in there for an hour to 90 minutes once a week and just spend time on the instrument. So usually I would get like the 90 minutes or so before a choir rehearsal when the church was quiet. If you're able to arrange something like that, if you don't have access to your own instrument, highly, highly valuable. You need to have time to be on the instrument with the foot pedals and then work on traditional organ music. If you have access to your own instrument, then that's just fantastic as well. And then I think once you've gotten accustomed to some basic repertoire, again, starting with the two manuals, then repertoire with some basic pedals, then I think at that point you can start to dip your toe in the water into, I think, what I would call more traditional organ music. And a great place to start is something like this. The Orgelbuchlein by Bach. These are the chorales. This is part of the foundational repertoire for organists. I would call this entry-level material, but essential material. So getting something like this, you're going to start with this. You're not going to start with the most difficult fugues that Bach wrote for the organ. And then, among the things you want to understand are, learn the stops. There's resources out there for those, because that's also one of the things that'll be new for the piano player. You sit in front of the organ and there's these tabs, usually on the organ, with names you're not familiar with numbers, you don't know what they mean. You need to know what those mean and then how to use those effectively to be able to understand how do you pull up a principal chorus, how do you pull up a cornet stop, when do you use the mixtures, and not every combination of stops is something that you want to just randomly do. There's a method to the madness on the stops. And then set expectations, time. Making the shift from piano to organ doesn't happen overnight. It does take time. It can take years, but it's a fulfilling journey. Very, very glad that I've made it. Set time to practice. And then I think the other thing that was a big shift for me was just understanding, I'm going to call it how to make music on the organ versus on the piano. So on the piano, I think I'm a dynamic player. So I make so much use of my hands and drawing colors and contrasts with different pressure from my fingers. When you sit on the organ, it doesn't matter how soft you press, how loud you press, the volume of the note is going to be the same. So everything that you learn as a piano player in terms of shaping music with the force and the softness of your fingers on the keyboard, that doesn't translate. So you have to learn other techniques to emote musicality from the organ. So I think that's the last thing that probably took me, it felt like several years to figure out. And that's something that I struggled with. But fast forward to today, feel comfortable in having an approach where I sit at the organ, I can emote musicality by understanding how to use the stops, how to use registrations, how to use the contrast between the either two keyboards, three keyboards, however many keyboards are on the instrument that I'm sitting at the time. And again, takes time, takes focus, and it's a different experience to sit at the organ than at the piano. And I think just in summary, I wanted to put kind of like an end cap and some rationale on some of this music that I've been putting out from Lorenz, because there's a connection that I make from that music to this journey that I took years ago to move myself from the piano to the organ. It was a useful resource for me. So I've rambled on a few things here. Hopefully, if you found yourself in the position of trying to make the leap from piano to organ, there's a nugget or two that may be of use to you. And if you're on that journey, I wish you the best. And if you have questions, you can ping me through the comments on the YouTube, and I'll be happy to answer anything that I can for you. With that, happy music making, and thank you for tuning in.